Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Advanced Squad Leader Red Factories. We've got the third turn for the Russians, and we're continuing on with some pretty bloody combat so far. Unfortunately for me, the weather roll did not result in any sort of change. There's actually a rule for civilian populations, like interrogation of civilians, but it doesn't really come up too often. I think, generally speaking, it's only by SSR, but I could be wrong on that one. You also need a 4, I believe, on that. And the Russians are kind of unlucky already. This is a good example as to just how great it is if you can manage to get units adjacent to your opponent. Not only did that squad suffer a casualty reduction because of the boxcars, the fact that there's an adjacent enemy unit automatically reapplies the desperation morale. So it's almost impossible to get him back into fighting condition at this point. And the machine gun, despite having a higher repair number, is going to be out of the picture once again. That's definitely something to keep in mind as well, if you happen to be playing this. There's always a lot of different values available for all the different things in play. So you definitely want to make sure that, especially with a heavy machine gun, medium machine guns I think might also get an increased number, but it might also depend on specific make and model. It's definitely something you want to pay attention to. And I guess, luckily for the Russians, the Germans suffer the same sort of boxcar problems. I'm actually not 100% sure if a casualty reduction via rally, which eliminates a unit, if it would also kill the support weapon that they're carrying, but I guess I'll just have to try to make a note to read that up at a later date. I should mention that guns like the 45mm cannon we have there can set up as what's called a hidden initial placement, or HIP unit. HIP units, generally speaking, are very rare just because of how powerful they are. They don't get revealed unless unless your opponent walks into the hex they occupy, as well as the other issue of them shooting. So that also, of course, will reveal themselves. One of the bonuses to a HIP unit is that, especially in the case of a gun, it is possible for the weapon to shoot and not reveal itself completely. So it can still remain concealed. Although there's a certain condition for it specifically, which makes it really strong to use, especially if you can keep it safe in specific locations. For example, I once had a game where I was the Germans versus Russians. They had gotten some tanks up through some open ground. I basically let the tank creep up right next to me, and as soon as he wasn't in a in a good position to shoot back. It was basically a point blank shot, couldn't miss, um, and just sent it into a blaze. So quite a lot going on so far. 2 casualty reductions via rally, 1 mortar break, a lot of support weapons, or every support weapon that was broken did not get repaired, and on top of that, we have a sniper that comes back. Now, for an off-board sniper, I'm not exactly sure how to go about calculating distance, because I don't in real life, you would just easily do it by getting another map board, and you just plonk it right on top of the board you're currently using, and then just using that to calculate distances. But unfortunately, in Vassal, you don't have that same ability. You can't just pop in a map whenever you want. I guess technically I could have maybe done overlays, but then I would have had to build it out. And anyways, long story short, I picked the C2 hex because I think it's closer. If my other like huge stack in G1 was actually the proper target, then I apologize to the viewers because I just didn't want to do the really long, time-consuming hex calculation. There's not much for these squads to do, or at least that unit and that leader to do, so I'm just going to have them do some prep fire. Unless I get really lucky, I'm not going to be able to move them. And this is kind of an issue as to fortified buildings. If you happen to find yourself in the upper level, you have to contend with those same fortifications that you built. So you always have to watch out for that sort of thing. It'll probably seem like I'm being very passive when it comes to movement with my Russians, but honestly, with so many 548s looming around on the left side, which are some of the best that the Germans have available, the tank that's nearby, and the potential crossfire everywhere, I don't want to risk the actually really good Soviet leaders that are available. They didn't really get any bad rolls. I just didn't want to risk them going into some stone locations and potentially missing out on them. I mean, if I'm already low on units, especially since I haven't done any major transfers of troops from the east side to the west side, it's not really something I want to, chance. This attack would have been even better had the 227 not cowered, which again reduces the firepower to the first column to the one column to the left. Yeah, this is the sort of thing you'll always have to contend with. Do I want to make this shot? Do I not risk it? If I don't attack, I'm going to have to move because I won't want to get shot by anything. And here, well, it's probably going to pay off. The leader's going to prevent the cowering. He's got a -1 modifier. The debris only gives a +1. And 8 on 8 is a normal morale check, so luckily for me, I break both squads. I think they've already been broken, so... In a previous turn, that is. Again, it should be stated, if you happen to be playing against somebody, um, obviously there's a degree of how casual you wanna be when playing against people. You don't want to be that guy that's just like always employs the rules and stuff, even though they're meant to be. Um, but if you can get away with it, especially if in Vassal, if someone ever checks line of sight, always force them to take the shot. Um, when it comes to the actual physical counters, that's what you would do. If anybody moves any counters to check line of sight, you do it with like a drawstring. Just because the string's normally like thin enough that it gives a reasonable idea if a unit can see from one hex to another. But if a unit ever does that, if your opponent ever checks line of sight, force them to take that shot, because one, the rules support that, and two, it can be very important as to how that affects the game. Specifically, if a unit can take a shot but doesn't, obviously you're missing out on any sort of firepower or damage that unit could do. But if a unit shoots and can't actually see because line of sight is broken, well, let's just say that's a huge advantage that you want to not like be a target of. Let's say I had two stacks that shoot into a hex. One doesn't have line of sight, and it could be that that's 16 firepower that is now gone to waste. And all the better for not having that 16 firepower against your own units. I feel like my move, which was an assault move, which is why those guys kept the concealment, I feel like that move, in hindsight, may have not been the best. I do like the idea of grabbing the buildings for the bonuses that are involved with it, but the main issue is that I'm going from a +3 to a +2 only. And so far, I kind of prefer the additional bonuses for the Russians. Another thing to keep in mind, the further we get into Stalingrad, you'll notice that there's a lot of hexes with a circle on them. For example, A10 has a circle on it, D2, O5, and so on. Those are actually manholes for access to sewers. Now, sewer movement's kind of weird, and I'm glad it's taking me at least some time in the initial scenario to get to them, because it's kind of... I don't want to say it's hard to explain, but the mechanics of movement in sewers are different than it would be on the normal map. So the idea is that if you're in the sewers, you can move to any location with a manhole as long as that location is 3 hexes to your current manhole position. So for example, the sewer in A10 would not be able to connect to the sewer in D2. Similarly, the cellar or sewer in O5, or better yet, V7, would not be able to connect with W12, even though they're relatively closer. That being said, W12 and Y12 do connect. It might not seem like all that much to begin with, but you'll notice that there's actually some sewer, or at least manholes, in quite a few buildings. So play your cards right, and you might actually be able to get a unit, dump them into the sewer, so to speak, anyways, and then completely get behind the enemy's front line without having to really worry about return fire or anything like that. There's some issues. Well, I shouldn't say issues, but there's some risks involved with getting into sewers, but we'll see that much later. This is probably going to be something I say more and more, at least up to a certain point, I guess. There's a thing I learned with regards to fortifications, such as trenches, that I hadn't known before, and I always thought it was really weird, especially after I learned it. I guess special credit should probably go to the two half squads, which, if you don't know who they are, they're a popular duo, or at least they are, so much as how far I've listened into their podcast. I'm trying to go by chronological order, and with like 200 episodes, it takes a while to get through. However, when it comes to the entrenchments, commonly known as like your foxholes, your shell holes, trenches, and so on, I learned that a unit that advances into a location with an entrenchment can actually automatically go into that entrenchment in the advance phase. And I always thought that was an illegal move because under normal circumstances, you do one move, say from P1 to P2, and then it costs you an extra move factor to get into the shell holes for that bonus. So it's really interesting, I guess, as to how that applies. And hopefully, I'll be able to check into this. I just want to make sure that I get it correctly, which is always the issue, I guess. In terms of move, I'm basically transferring or starting my transfer of guys from the eastern position all the way to the western one. Here I was trying to... my idea was to get units up into this giant debris field because technically nobody would have line of sight on them. Or at least like to shoot out of from where those guys are currently. But in like a turn, I'm going to realize that if I try to keep moving into there, I'm basically consigning those guys to close quarters combat, because there's not really going to be any way for them to retreat anywhere. I could retreat them south into that row of buildings or into the stone rubble locations, but honestly, it feels like such a huge risk considering all of the various squads that are there currently. And this was actually really unfortunate. I really wasn't expecting to get snake eyes, which I guess is a normal thing. But it just felt like a throwaway shot from me. And hey, look, it did something. So I believe the specific rule that I was referencing for the advance with regards to entrenchments, or I guess more specifically fortifications, infantry units which are neither broken pin, TI, nor mark the CC counter may use the advance phase to move one hex horizontally or vertically to a different adjacent building level location of the same hex, but not both. Basically what that means is you can't move diagonally. So you wouldn't be able to go, say in the one of the factory buildings that we can see, you can't go up a set of stairs from the ground floor to the first floor and then an extra move to one of the rooms adjacent to that first floor location. That just wouldn't make sense. You're just spending too much. You're getting too much move out of it, and so on. A unit may not change both its location within a hex and also the hex it is in during the same advance phase, although it could change both elevation and hex in an advance phase by advancing to an adjacent hex of different elevation, such as a hill or depression. Basically what that means is that while you can't move vertically and horizontally, you can move, say, diagonally if it permits it, but only specifically under the conditions of like a hill, which is obviously you're going to an adjacent location, but it is also higher. So that's not an illegal move. The one hex advance may even be from inside an entrenchment to inside another in an accessible hex, even if on different levels. A unit's IPC during the advance phase is unchanged except as restricted by difficult terrain, which I don't think we're going to see too much of. Some of the Q&As for that question are that if a unit's in a foxhole in an open ground hex, can it advance into an adjacent building hex? And the answer is yes. So taking that into consideration, there should be no reason why you can't do so. Let's see if I can find anything else that may support that. Oh, and since it's defensive fire, it just means that, well, it's the Germans' time to shine. Doesn't seem like there's too much going on. Unfortunately, while doing these commentaries, if I'm checking the rulebook, I may miss some stuff, but I guess I should also point out that there is one named leader so far, and I believe there will be a second one at some point. But I think both are Russian leaders, so definitely, and there's definitely a lot of other leaders available to choose from. Some of these roles are just for the sake of trying to get something good, and realistically, I probably shouldn't be making them, but you know, whatever. I should have also done a fire group with that hex or that stack that just fired, and the guys underneath the trench at the fortified location. Just because, even though there's just a half squad, I think, in that trench, there is also an ATR, which is doubled if I was shooting at the fortified location. So we're looking at least 6 from that, and there was probably another 8 or so, I think, from the original stack. So something like 14 firepower that would have ended up being. It should. I should also point out, just because it's not. I don't find it's like terribly obvious to begin with. Um, you should always have careful consideration as to who you pair your support weapons with. Um, the reason for that is we can see that in the Germans' case, a medium machine gun gives 5 firepower, and up top at what is that, N0, we have a heavy machine gun that has 7 firepower. And you might think like, oh, big whoop, the medium machine gun gives 5 firepower, so it's just a 4 firepower shot. The light machine gun gives 3, and the heavy machine gun with 7, it just means it goes down to 6. Basically, all the machine guns for the Germans go down one category, one column of firepower. And you should really take at least some time to consider how you basically how you divvy out your guns, especially if you can deploy as well. It's always a bonus, because you can do basically one of 2 ways, well, 3 ways, I guess. You can do just lackadaisical, whoever you think should have them gets them, whatever. Minimal thought and hope for the best, really. You can also put or attempt to get support weapons on high firepower units. Yeah, there's me forgetting the artillery again. So I think I'm just going to roll it and we'll pretend like it's at the start. Thankfully, I didn't really shoot at anybody that the artillery is currently at, so it's not going to make too much of a difference with regards to shots, since there's already, like, I haven't actually affected anybody there. But getting back to the support weapon talk, you really want to pay attention as to who gets what. Again, you can create large stacks and just hope that the accumulated firepower of, say, like a heavy machine gun with, say, like a 5.48 would be good. But you always have to take into consideration if, say, you had a medium machine gun with a Sturm company, you're getting 10 firepower, and we can see on this table that that's not useful, because that's going down to the 8 column. But if you gave that same 5 firepower to, say, a 2x whatever morale, you can then get yourself up 2 columns to the right with 7 going down to 6. And in certain cases, depending on nationality and stuff, the firepower ranges will differ. So it can make a big difference between having a unit that just does that loses firepower versus is a unit being capable of maximizing their utility with said firepower. So again, you can think about how you would deploy your units, basically splitting a full squad into 2 half squads, which won't decrease your CVP. Like, it won't give CVP to an enemy side and that sort of stuff. On the plus side, by deploying, you're also giving potentially more targets for your enemy to your opponent to shoot at, and so on and so forth. So it's definitely something to always think about. Another thing that comes into mind is that, let's say if you were the Russians and you had a full squad, but their range is 2, as commonly seen, at least at the moment. And you want to make sure that you can get the maximum effect of their firepower. There's nothing stopping you from giving said full squad 2 machine guns that drastically outweigh their own firepower. For example, even just getting a heavy machine gun and a medium machine gun for the Germans gives you 12 firepower, which, you know, if you have a full squad that only does 2, 3, or 4, you're tripling that firepower for some good effect. It should be noted that, again, this is why you want to roll a bunch of stuff. So, in the Germans' attempt to get something going with regards to their artillery, they managed to generate a heat of battle with the 246 squad that we can see. Unfortunately for the Germans, that heated battle was such a good roll that it actually created a hero within that squad. Sadly, I don't think I ever named him. Heroes are kind of weird in the sense that I haven't really played enough scenarios that have had heroes occur. I do, however, have a pack of scenarios that all include a hero to begin with. Sadly, I've never been able to find anybody that's willing to put time into it. Mainly because finding time for ASL is tough. Hence why I'm playing this solo. However, a hero is, well, it's a hero. Think of like an iconic person in any sort of war movie you've ever seen. One that does a really good job, able to pin people by himself, does heroic deeds. We can see that they've got 3 numbers, so yes, a hero actually has their own strength factor, which is different from any of the leaders. Leaders generally will have a sort of hidden value for their strength, for their firepower, but it only technically applies in certain circumstances, say like close combat, melee, and like routing purposes. But a hero is specifically stated, so you can always use them to generate an additional firepower in terms of attacking stuff. There's some other bonuses to heroes. They don't break. They don't go berserk. They don't cower, and they don't get pinned. That being said, they do get wounded like leaders, so always keep that in mind. It should also be mentioned that heroes actually get a... they can apply a -1 DRM to their to hit or the IFT DR. That's if they're not using a machine gun. If they are using a machine gun, which they can do so by themselves, they'd add a +1. I believe there are cases where they can add a -1 as well. Yes. So in 15.24, Heroic DRM, a hero, any fire group, or any fire group that he's part of, can deduct 1 from its IFT/close combat resolution DR. So anytime that hero helps with the shot, you can subtract 1 from that dice roll. It basically just makes any group he's part of that much better. Another thing that gets really strong is that the hero's DRM is cumulative with other heroes and leaders. And on top of that, a hero that is part of, say, a fire group applies his -1 DRM regardless of if there's multiple hexes involved and so on. Which is something that, if I haven't explained, I guess someone should remind me at some point to do that again. So I get kind of lucky here, especially for such a good roll. I wouldn't have expected a task check, basically. Again, it might not seem like a big deal when your sniper result is, simply put, a excuse me, a pin. But keep in mind, since this is the Russian turn, that pin basically means that that squad can't advance. Under normal circumstances, that would effectively be an extra move for them to do. Actually, it also reminds me of something else that I'd read somewhere. I think I'm going to have to wait until I think about it again. Because I remember there being something about if a unit moves, there's something else that they can't do later on in the turn. Thankfully, I can make this shot, but it's not a very strong one to begin with. And because they're Berserk, it gives them just that extra edge. Had they been a normal unit, they would have perished at that point. Well, at least broken, anyways. Oh, I guess I should also point out um, any weapon that fires in the advanced phase, regardless of if they have a rate of fire or not, does not apply it uh, in that stage or in that phase, I should say. Thinking about it, this was actually something I don't think I could do. Oh no, wait, never mind. I could because of the. I think I calculated from the leader that's pinned. That's actually wrong, and don't count from the leader, but the squad behind them. The reason being that the fact that the pin negates the firepower of that group effectively means that they can't apply interdiction. Since it's the rout phase, those two squads actually die. There's no chance for them to do anything because they can't move anywhere. So that's another. Technically, that should be another 4 casualty victory points for the Germans. But like I said in a previous video, I don't think I calculated it properly. So. These guys should have had a DM applied just because they were shot at. I have to say that I was really desperate to get that heavy machine gun. I really didn't want to lose it in that location, which is why I kept sending, especially crews, to go over there and at least try to survive, and then take that heavy machine gun and move it elsewhere. As you can see, that has not been successful so far. And here's how an earlier mistake compounds itself further. Because I didn't move that initial stack into a building location with a leader, technically I could route I could have routed those guys into a building and probably followed up and all that, but I'm losing a turn with rallies again and so on. Had I just moved that initial squad into a building, it would have just been so much simpler in getting them to a location that gives them an additional bonus to rally attempts. This area is actually getting really tough to decide who I should advance and where. You always come across the problem of creating death stacks in buildings, which has the same sort of implications as moving units in a stack, which we've seen me do plenty of times with the Germans and suffer consequences for. The same applies to keeping too many units in one singular location. Because even though a building, say with a fortified building, which has a massive amount of, we'll say, damage reduction for purposes, because you can get in such a really good location, and it might seem really good to stuff a lot of units in there, if something does happen, because lucky rolls happen, you don't really ever call upon them, so to speak, you end up with the issue that one lucky dice roll or die roll can effectively destroy whatever sort of strong point or anchor point you have in your defensive line. So it comes back to a very delicate balance between having a lot of units in one location to minimize, I guess, the dangers of being spread out, and also the bonuses of being in fire groups, with also that vulnerability that if something ever happens, you're kind of screwed. I think I'm going to choose to do this after the fact, and I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. I also don't think that CX... I can't remember who that CX would have applied to at this point. Been talking about so much stuff and not truly paying attention to what the current state of the board is. So again, I probably should have advanced early during the actual advance phase, but we'll give myself that concession. Advancing into another building location, there should be an ambush dice roll, and I forget if I actually roll for it, because it doesn't matter if there's if anybody's concealed or not. It's the mere fact of advancing in that sort of terrain that determines whether or not you're going to roll for ambush. And speaking of, I think I'm going to check right now just to clarify, because I believe I stated that ambush doesn't go below 0, but I think I was wrong on that. Yeah, it doesn't specifically state. So we're going to assume that your ambush number can go below 0. Again, ambushes are actually really strong if you can manage to ambush your opponent, because it gives you that opportunity to do a few things. First and foremost, if you just want to go straight into the combat and the bloodlust, on an ambush, if you manage to get your kill number, and we could declare potentially hand-to-hand at some point in the campaign, so keep in mind the numbers for that specifically. However, again, if you manage to roll your kill number for close combat, basically what happens is you go first. So it's actually really strong. And when you have something like a leader that applies their die roll modifier, and you can apply stuff like CX to your opponent, or if they are CX'd, if you can pin them as well, all these things get to be very beneficial. as we can see, even though I'm on like a 1 to 2, even if they didn't have the CX modifier, the fact that the -2 liters there is really good. And the same idea, like that half squad was holding the machine gun, so they should have brought it down with them. Now here I'm gonna have the I think I go on a 2 separate attacks with the Russians, or I should be doing a 3 to 2, I believe. Yeah, I think I do a 3 to 2 attack, but the Germans are going to attack on a 1 to 1 ratio because that's all they have, and I'd rather not have them roll on a 1 to 2. So 3 to 2 is, well, unfortunately, still requires a 6, which the Russians did not get, and the Germans managed to get their 4 to eliminate a submachine gun company unit. And because, again, you don't keep rolling close combats, it means that those 2 squads, are still locked in a melee and won't be able to do anything until the next close combat phase. So, once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.